Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Paul Vaughn, one of the 23 pro-lifers recently pardoned by President Trump. Welcome to the podcast, Paul. I'm very excited for this conversation.
Likewise, Colleen. Thanks for having me today.
It's a great honor to have you here. And before we begin talking about your experience being arrested and everything you've gone through since then, could you give our audience a little background on who you are and how you got involved in the pro-life movement?
Sure. Well, we've been sidewalk counseling. My wife and I actually met doing sidewalk counseling in an abortion clinic outside in Dallas, Texas, actually. And, we just got paired up as part of a national event and said, hey, you guys go out at this time and somebody else go out at another time. And so that's how we met. And, prior to that, I had a prominent member in Operation Rescue, was really involved in my life and just in my personal faith journey and coming back to Christ and everything. And they were very involved in pro-life ministry. So it was just kind of a natural outreach to be the hands and feet of the gospel and of Christ, going out and ministering to people where they were hurting and needed to make good choices.
Yeah. While you were sidewalk counseling and, helping mothers choose life outside abortion clinics previous to this experience, had you ever run into any trouble or gotten arrested or had any sort of run-ins with the law or pro-abortion people?
Sure. Well, always run-ins with pro-abortion people, of course. There's always the clinic defenders and the troublemakers out there that are for some reason have a vested interest in moms killing their children. I never quite understood getting so excited about that. But prior to FACE, we did rescue some back in the early 90s where, peaceful sit-in, like some of the folks in my group were doing the day of the event in March of 21, which is the Nashville portion of the 23 folks, that were ultimately pardoned by Trump. But once FACE came down in 94, it took what was a Class B misdemeanor, an extension really of First Amendment speech of just being able to identify with the unborn and sitting down and putting our life, in front of between the victim and the aggressor, as it were. And I like to, Colleen, one of the motivating factors there, and I think it's important, even though I didn't rescue as the term that pro-lifers like to use on the day in question. I have in the past, and I know the heart and the spirit of those people. And it's just important, I think, to know that it's not a protest like we see with Hamas or BLM or somebody at the Capitol building or, in blocking streets and, highways and what have you. It is much more of a passive statement of identification that unborn child is made in the image of God. And because of that, it has worth and value just like we do. And that we're going to follow the example of our Creator. And when He interposed Himself on the cross between us and the enemy of our soul. And so that's all when a Christian goes in and does, quote, what's a sit-in in political vernacular, it's really more of a spiritual expression of a love for that child that's at risk and willing to lay down their freedoms and lay down their life and go to jail. So that is a explanatory, statement. We did do that in the early 90s, prior to FACE. But once FACE came along, of course, that was the desire to stop the effectiveness of Christians actually going out and being the hands and feet of Christ to the world and to the hurting moms and the babies, on the pro-abortion community, if you will. If there's any such thing of community in that respect, I think that's probably not the right word. But to those people in need. And but yeah, certainly since then, for over 3 decades, we've done peaceful, nonviolent street ministry, sidewalk counseling, and never had any problems with the law. Like I said, you always run into some pro-aborts that are angry and upset, and usually successfully able to diffuse them, and never any violence on our part, certainly. And then never any violence on the day in question of this event. Peacefully singing hymns and reading Bible verses and ministering to the police officers, talking about Romans 13 and the civil magistrate's duty, and we had a unique situation there we can get to if you want, but both the police chief and the lead negotiator were Christians and pastors in this particular case. So it was a fun time in the hallway that day.
Yeah, so you were inside the abortion clinic, I believe. So could you just walk our audience through what that day was like?
Yeah, so we weren't actually inside the abortion clinic. That's a misnomer, and it's been reported several times. It was a public use building, a multi-use building. So there was the abortion clinic, there was a dentist, there was surgeons and other types of facilities and businesses in the building. So we were in the public hallway of a multi-use building, and that's that's what was going on. So we were there. The folks that wanted to do the rescue, the sit-in aspect of it, sat down in front of the abortion clinic doors at the end of one of the public hallways. The rest of us were, we had hundreds of folks. We had people out on the sidewalks with signs, people singing hymns, everybody praying, people ministering to, sidewalk counselors stationed in the parking lot to try to talk to women. And we had a handful of us in the hallway, just looking to identify people coming off the escalator and or the elevator rather, and just be able to interact and hopefully engage them in a conversation to save their child.
Yeah. So for anyone in our audience who doesn't know what the FACE Act is, could you just give them a little brief synopsis of what it is that you were violating or you were said to have violated?
Sure, you bet. And I didn't actually violate. We can get to how the Conspiracy Act made me guilty of the underlying offense of FACE. But it's FACE, the FACE Act, is the freedom of access to clinic entrances. And this is a brainchild of Chuck Schumer, was a congressman back in the time. And I think it was Representative Kennedy as well back then that came up with this under the Clinton administration. And basically, Colleen, what happened is, like I said, the Christians were being so effective in showing the love of Christ to people that abortion mills were shutting down and abortions were declining, and they wanted, the only way they figured they could stop it was with some federal legislation. And so what this law said was it makes it a felony now, and put this in context with all the civil rights protest groups, right, from civil rights back in the day to ACT UP and the gay and lesbian protest groups in the 80s and 90s, Antifa and BLM of our recent times, and figure out which one of those groups have ever faced a felony for a sit-in protest and trying to discuss and make a political discourse out of their agenda, their issue, right? It was only the Christians that received that. And that's what the FACE Act did, is it took what would be a Class B misdemeanor, lots of times a $40, $60 fine, a night in jail while you're waiting on to see the judge or something. And that was the extent of what a sit-in would have been and is for everybody else except Christians, and anywhere else but abortion clinics. And so if you are indeed at an abortion clinic and you sit in now, it is a federal offense, and it was punishable by 6 months in prison and a misdemeanor the first time around if there's no violence or anything associated with it. Now, to get this passed, and to be fair, they also threw in that, hey, you know what, we'll protect the crisis pregnancy centers and churches as well. And so we'll make it a felony if somebody comes and protests at a church or blocks you or impedes you from getting in church, that they can be charged. And of course, the only people that substantially have been charged with this is pro-life Christians. There's been tons of violence, against the resource centers and churches that have just not been touched.
Yeah, definitely. So then did someone at the clinic or the abortion mill, were they the ones that called the police on you?
Sure. There was a private security guard at the medical facility. And so he called the police, and I'm pretty sure it came out in discovery. The clinic called the police as well. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, apparently they had the FBI on speed dial because the FBI was on site before we left as well. And so they had what none of the other, as a local Tennessee businessman, I don't have the FBI on speed dial and don't have that relationship. So that's an interesting point in the case as well as we talk about the case and the arrest and stuff.
Mm-hmm. So then what happened?
Well, yeah. So, that day of the event, there were 12 people arrested for trespassing, for not leaving when the police told them to. They said, hey, we identify with the babies. The babies can't walk up and, get up and walk out. They're stuck there. No one can to speak to them. And so we're willing to go to jail to make that point and to identify with them. There were 4 minors that were cited and released, and then 8 adults that were arrested and processed through the local jail for the local court case. Local court case is ultimately dismissed. But it was Colleen, it was 18 months later that the FBI shows up at my door. And remember, I didn't break face. I didn't block anything. I didn't interfere with anyone. I literally didn't even talk to a client. We had other teams that did. I talked with the police officers, sang hymns, and read my Bible, and that's all I did. And I talked to the media, which is a fairly good crime apparently under Biden's DOJ. But I get the FBI raid at 7:00 on October 5th in 2022. So 18 months later, they show up, guns drawn, 4 agents, 2 cars, flashing lights, banging on my house, rattling the old lead glass windows in our old farmhouse, shaking the whole place. Open up, FBI. And I had just sent 3 of my children out to the car, about to take them to co-op, their homeschool co-op and stuff. And I'm just not processing. Maybe other people would better be quicker in their mental capacity at 7:00 in the morning than I was. But I thought somebody left the TV on or something. There's some bad drama playing in the living room. Or why is somebody yelling, "Open up, FBI"? As I made my way to the door to look out the curtain and see, I looked out the side window that had no curtains on it, where my kids should have been. Didn't see them, but saw the flashing lights and the 2 cars. And so I find out later, 3 of my children were held by a guy in tactical gear with a long gun and pistol at the side of our woods, and detained them and wouldn't let them go back in the house, telling them they're there to arrest their daddy, their father. And I make my way to the door and pull back the curtains, to look and see, only to see a long gun, automatic rifle, and a pistol pointed at my head by 2 of the agents. I asked, who they're looking for. And instead of saying Paul Vaughn and clarifying, they said, "We're looking for you," with no identity. Who is you? Is it me? Is it somebody else? Right? It's almost like they wanted to escalate the situation. And God gave me the grace in the midst of all that. I figured out there's no, the easiest way for this to end is with me in handcuffs. And as I stepped out the door, I asked for identification and under whose authority, they were operating under. And as they spun me around and put me in handcuffs, one little cocky FBI agent points at his Velcro badge on his chest and says, "This is the only identification you get." And literally none of this, "Can I see the warrant, please? Can I see some identification? Would you please step outside?" It wasn't any of that. It was a full-blown Gestapo. And so anyway, they put me in handcuffs, put me in the car. And, the meantime, my 16-year-old is, "Mommy, the FBI is here. They're arresting Daddy." And my wife, comes out. And of course, she was already heard the noise and was headed that direction. But, she had the foresight to come bring her camera and got some video footage of them, which really helped, I think, expose the corruption and expose the lunacy, of what was going on there. And
yeah. Yeah, I saw her video on your Substack. I was watching that, and it was very interesting to see the footage. I'm glad that she had the forethought to actually do that.
Yeah, that was the grace of God as well. And it's so funny, Colleen, just the agents were so cocky in their arrogant attitude. One particular, 3 others are just, doing their deal, quote, doing their job, which they should be held accountable for still. But the one guy's just bobbing his head. My wife's asking, why, what are you doing? What's going on? And he's like, "You want to know? You really want to know?" And give him the head bob kind of attitude. When that camera came out, the guns went from low ready down to behind the back. And the attitude went from, "Do you really want to know?" to, "Well, ma'am, we tried to tell you." It was just the change in attitude was phenomenal. And just really telling, I think, on, we've been found out. Now what do we do? Kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so we're grateful for that. We're grateful nobody was hurt. 2 months later, that same group, whether it's those 4 agents or other agents, but the Nashville office killed a guy under a similar early morning raid. Mm-hmm. And I don't know the details. Nobody does, because they're investigating themselves. So even our state senators couldn't find out what happened there. But that's what's been going on. That's part of the narrative, I think. Part of the story God's exposing is the corruption in our law enforcement and things like that.
Yeah. How long did it take you to figure out that it was because of pro-life things that you were being arrested? Did they tell you that up front? It sounds like if they're not giving you really any identification, they might not have laid out exactly why you were being arrested.
Sure. No, that's a great point. I knew once I was in the car and they had closed the doors and we were ready to roll out, they turned around and showed me the warrant on the laptop. Now I had no glasses, I couldn't read it, but I was able, since FACE Act is always in capital letters, I was able to say, okay, it's FACE, it's pro-life related. We'll figure it out. I still didn't know it was from, a year and a half earlier. I didn't know what the actual event was or anything until much later. But here's the real atrocity here is that they didn't tell my wife, they didn't tell my children, they didn't tell my sheriff, they didn't tell my state representative or senator, my governor. Nobody in the state of Tennessee knew where I was for 6 hours or why I was arrested or if they were even, legitimate FBI. I mean, I can buy the Velcro badge for $6. I looked it up on an Army Navy surplus, site. And they didn't, it's not like they have uniforms or badges that they showed. So that was the real atrocity, I think, and especially in relation to my family. They leave my kids crying in the living room and my wife trying to manage, we had 7 of our 11 children were home that day and without knowing any details, and so it was a mess they left behind.
Yeah. How did your wife and kids take it?
Well, my wife was great knowing, we've grown up in this, our marriage has been forged in pro-life work and such. So, but she still didn't know that's what it was, but she didn't think I had crooked business dealings or anything like that it could be, but she just didn't know. But she just told the kids, look, what happened to Daddy that was wicked and evil. And we need to pray. Daddy's going to be okay. God's with him. He'll protect him. But we need to be praying and just really trying to encourage him. And we had a great close friend that was with my oldest son. We had a weekly prayer breakfast at the local coffee shop, and my wife made a phone call, and they both showed up within 5 minutes. Matter of fact, we passed them on the car on the way out of town as they were headed to my house. They saw us. I didn't see them from the back seat, but it was neat. God provided that support, and then of course they went and started calling FBI agents and offices and trying to find out what's going on, but they never did until the court-appointed attorney. I finally got them to call the house to let my family know.
Gotcha. How did you feel when all that was happening?
It was surreal. It was just. Once I saw that it was FACE, I knew that it was stupid politics and that it wasn't a legitimate charge. And no matter if it was the fact that we were training sidewalk counselors, if that was the angle or if it was from one of our events, I honestly didn't think 18 months ago that it would have been the one particular one. And especially since I didn't break any laws there, I didn't break FACE, I didn't break local laws. The police were on the evening news that night bragging about how peaceful we were. And I have to this day a good relationship with that department and with those officers that we talked with. And in fact, the lead negotiator testified on my behalf in the federal trial. So yeah, it was really hard to process, what was going on. And then, of course, we had an hour drive to the federal courthouse in Nashville. They put the leg irons and everything on me to walk in and process me into the federal processing with the federal marshals and put me in the holding cell with a drug dealer and a guns dealer and, criminals that we got to minister to and pray with. So that was fun. And, we have that going for us. And yet ultimately processed. And they dumped me out. This was the other part of the process is the punishment. They dumped me out on the streets of Nashville 6 hours later with no ID, no wallet, no money, no phone. And it's like, here you go, you're free. Well, 65 miles, an hour and a half drive from home. And, it was a fun experiment, though, Colleen. If you ever get a chance to go around any major city and just start asking people to borrow their cell phone, you learn a lot about the character of the people in your town. And I've been separated from my wife, and I need to call her. I don't have my ID or my phone on me. And I found it worked better. The further you got away from the federal courthouse, the easier it was to convince people to help you.
Yeah. So basically, you had been praying in an abortion clinic. The police came, asked you to leave, you left, and then 18 months later, the FBI showed up and arrested you for that.
Yeah. Yep. And here's the hook, Colleen. This is what is not very well understood and is really gets subterfuge is because you have people, I testified in December for the Senate House subcommittee, and even the Democrats there kept pushing the narrative that I blocked a door or that I impeded somebody. And it's just utterly untrue. And all they're doing is reading the indictment and the court case. And that's what I was found guilty of. But here's the secret. The reason I was found guilty of breaking FACE was because they took what's called the Civil Rights Act, and its code is whatever public name is the KKK Act. It was passed in the late 1800s, and that law makes it a felony to conspire together to deprive someone of their civil right of voting. In the case of blacks in our country that had won the right to vote, and there were still people that were trying to intimidate them and stop them, and there was violence and beating and all this. Literally, the paragraph after the paragraph in my charge said it's illegal to go up on the highway in hoods. I mean, that's the law. And there's a DOJ lawyer, Sanjay Patel, that wrote in March of 22, in anticipation of Dobbs and Roe, being overturned. He wrote in the quarterly DOJ Journal, and he said, hey, this is a novel idea. We might be able to use this conspiracy in conjunction with the FACE Act to go after pro-lifers. Mm-hmm. And he said there's 3 advantages. And 1, it takes a misdemeanor and makes it a felony. Mm-hmm. 2, it takes a 6-month charge into a 10-year, a decade-long prison sentence. And 3, and this is the main point, is it doesn't require an overt act of the underlying infraction. So I don't have to impede, block, or actually do anything in the FACE Act. All I have to do is be ideologically aligned with those who are, and now I'm part of the conspiracy. And so that's what they used to come after me, and that's why they showed up banging on my door with guns, is because they took it and made it a felony, and somehow I still don't know. We're seeking for answers on the how come the people in Tennessee, Chuck Gallagher and myself, the 2 defendants, got the heavy-handed armed raid, and the other people in other jurisdictions of the DOJ and the FBI got the phone call, Mr. Boyd, could you come down and talk with us? Oh, I'm sorry, the judge is late. Let me buy you lunch. We'll talk, and then we'll come back over and see the judge. Right? That's how it should have been for someone who's been in the community for 17 years, is a business owner, that's not a flight risk, that has no history of violence, no trouble with the law prior to this. That's what should have happened. But there's a lot to tell there, and I have suspicions. The agent, my agent called when we got in the car was Mark Schaefer. Mark Schaefer was the agent that showed up. I told you they were on speed dial and showed up at the clinic. Mm-hmm. He was the agent on all the paperwork and taking the statements and names of those in the clinic. He identified himself as the FACE Act task force person, if you will. And it's interesting, 30 days after my arrest, Mark Schaefer gets promoted to the Office of U.S. Congressional Affairs. So he moves from Nashville up to D.C., retired this last August, and now he is the head of security at a Christian university here in Middle Tennessee, Lipscomb University, hired the guy that raided a Christian pro-life family at gunpoint and put him in charge of the Christian campus security. So these are questions that are out there that, like to understand the thought process behind the promotion, behind the retirement, just as the election heated up, behind the new job, and why a Christian university would hire a man like this. So lots of questions around his interaction, in our case.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot to really dig into and look for answers in.
Yeah.
So then you were facing 10 years in prison, you said, a decade for this?
Technically, would have been 11 if potential, because there was no violence. The FACE Act is only 6 months, so it would have been 10 and a half years potentially that we had hanging over our head from October of 2022 until sentencing in July of last year.
Okay. And then what happened with that as they moved forward with it? Because I believe that you were under house arrest, but you never actually went to jail?
Correct. I spent the 6 hours that morning in custody in the federal holding facility under the courthouse at the benevolence and hospitality of the Marshals Service. And so the trial went forward, Colleen, in January. We finally got to the trial, January 24. And there's a whole nother story of the judicial branch of government and the rules of evidence. And why does the federal government have a 98% conviction rate when they go to trial? And of course, they offered us plea deal after plea deal. They knew they had overcharged us and they knew they were wrong. All they wanted was numbers to pad the statistics to make it look like a narrative of, pro-lifers being violent. And we wouldn't give in to that. We didn't take any deals. We wouldn't take a bargain. We could have pled down to a misdemeanor with no jail time. And we said, no, you guys are wrong, and I can't. The same thing that motivates me to stand up for the babies and to identify with them and not follow the narrative that it's a choice is the same thing that said, look, I'm not taking a deal that says I'm guilty of something I didn't do. And so if you want to drop the charges, fine, that's on you. We'd accept that. But if you're pressing any charges, then we're going to go to trial, knowing that there was a 2% chance of victory in a federal court when we got there. But ultimately, we were found guilty by the jury because of the limitation of the evidence that clearly showed I was innocent, and ended up at sentencing in July with 6 months house arrest and 3 years parole. And of course, I'd already been on parole for 2 years at that point because pre-sentencing release is basically the same office and the same conditions, prior to the trial and everything.
Yeah. During that time before you were sentenced, did you ever regret going to the clinic that day?
Oh, not at all. No, it was so, God is so good, Colleen. It'd be really easy to second guess yourself if it was something that you did and that you knew you were, out of line, or you were being violent, or you were being angry or anything. And my actions, I was completely at peace with how God saw my actions that day. I knew legally I broke no law. I did nothing wrong. So the very fact that I was even in this trial was God's plan. It was, the government meant it for evil, and they wanted to intimidate Christians, not just my family, but a broad narrative of intimidation, around the world. And so I knew that God was in it and that he would be faithful to tell the story, as he wants to tell it. And I think, if anything, my real prayer is that it really encourages the church and Americans, broadly, that if you trust God and you put yourself in his story and just give yourself to it and not try to manipulate it, not try to manage it, just trust him, and that he will tell the story in a way that glorifies him and brings about the cultural narrative and the story that hopefully encourages, our country and encourages the faithful in our country as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm so impressed by how much peace you seem to have about this. If I were in that position, I think I would just be, even if I knew I'd done nothing wrong, I think I'd be so mad at the injustice. I would struggle to be in the state that you seem to be, of like accepting it and just trusting God.
Sure. Well, fortunately, I had a lot of people being angry for me. And so there was the outcry across America really was, phenomenal to see that people saw through the narrative and they weren't buying it. It's like in basketball, you don't buy the head fake of the guy that you're defending. He's trying to get through. And America wasn't buying the head fake of the government narrative. And so that was, it was peaceful. And I was grateful for that. But the other thing I think that everybody needs to understand, Colleen, that when you put yourself in that story and put yourself at risk, which you really do, going out to the clinic every day of being assaulted, flipped off, and cussed at, and people being angry because they're in a hard situation, that when you put yourself at risk, that God's grace always rises to the occasion. And so whatever it is, whether it's a local argument and somebody being mad at you, or whether it's a federal trial, his grace is sufficient. And we have, of course, the story of our Lord, who, didn't, and now he cried, he prayed, and he said, Lord, if it be possible, let it pass, but nevertheless, thy will be done. He gave us the example. He said, if they persecuted me, how much more are they going to persecute you? They persecute the master, they persecute the servant. And so I think that is the history we see in Christendom. And so God also prepares you for things like this. The reading list that I had going into this 2 years prior to this event and to the arrest was just, you look back on it and just see God's hand in it amazingly. So he always prepares us for where he takes us.
Yeah. What was house arrest like? Was that weird? Was it like strange to be in your house and not be able to leave? Were you able to spend time with your family that you weren't able to before?
Yeah, it's kind of a strange bag. It's more of a political poke in the eye than it is punishment. Okay. And I think it's really more the narrative the judge needed, to say she did something. Because I tell you, again, the letters the court received, hundreds of letters came in from all over the nation. The letters each of us individually brought from our family and our friends and business associates, and even my state senator and state representative knew me because I do business in the state. I've been up to the state house several times, so they wrote letters on my behalf. And the judge is looking at the charges, looking at the DOJ, and she's like, she's a liberal Clinton appointee, right? She's ideologically left of us, and probably hated the fact that we were out there on the streets to begin with around abortion. But she looked at those letters and looked at the evidence and said, I don't want to be that person that's putting these people in jail. And so the government was asking for over a year in prison for me, and she gave us 3 years parole and 6 months house arrest. And it was weird. It was very, it's almost more infuriating because that whole parole time period, a normal Christian marriage, you got a husband and wife and God making decisions, and you're praying and making the decisions for your family. But for over 2 years, it was the husband, wife, and the federal agent making decisions of, can we travel? Can we do this? Reporting our income and all these just minor little, nipping kind of frustrations that just point out the injustice. And it wasn't like I was in prison like many of my co-defendants and others from D.C. and others that were in jail over a year through this. I mean, that's obviously egregious. The J6ers and all those people are some 3 or 4 years in prison. Just atrocious, what they went through. So in light of the big picture, it was nothing, but it was just enough of a nuisance and a pain to remind you of the tyranny that our nation is sitting under. And so that was a constant reflection, and honestly, a prompt to pray for those that were in jail and everything else. Every time the parole officer would call the house, or I had to report something, or needed to go outside of my district to pick up, for work or something like that, I had to get permission. And so it's just a constant reminder that we're not our own. We're bought with a price. The government thinks they own us, but we know the reality is different.
Yeah. So out of the people who were at the clinic with you, they were also prosecuted by the FBI, right? Or was it just you?
Myself and Chet Gallagher. So only the people in the Middle Tennessee district received the welcoming committee from the FBI. The others they got a phone call or came down and turned themselves in or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So then out of the 23 pro-lifers who were pardoned by Trump, it was all from different incidents. It wasn't all from like a couple incidents.
That's correct. And that's a good point of clarification. A lot of the D.C. folks did get heavy-handed raids. I know Jonathan Darnell had his door busted in, busted it off the frame, and the FBI never paid for it. It wasn't even his house. It's a rental house, and, federal damage to the guy's property, and they never apologized, never fixed it, never did anything. And I don't know the details of all of the ones in the DC case, but I know some were more heavy-handed than others. Mm-hmm. But in the Nashville case, of the 11 that were in ours, that was true of us. Only the 2 of us in Middle Tennessee got the heavy-handed raid.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that some of the pro-lifers who were pardoned were in jail, because I met the husband of Joan Bell at the March for Life, and she was busy talking to someone, but I got to talk to him briefly. And she had just gotten out of jail that morning. So we saw her at the march as well, and we were just on a podcast with her the other night as well with she and Chris. So it was great to see her. She's when we first moved to Tennessee, she was here, and we went out to our first January event out at the abortion clinic in 2000. And she had some of her little babies out there, her recently adopted babies, and was sharing the testimony of them. And so she's just a saint, a true saint everywhere, and it's always good to be with her. Yeah. Yeah. So what was it like to find out you were being pardoned by Trump? When did you find that out? Was it a surprise? Did you see that coming? What was that experience? Yeah,
another crazy chapter in the story, right? My wife and I, Beth, saw Trump at the NRB conference last year in Nashville. Since it was local, we went to it and got to meet with some folks and shop around our story and just try to enjoy the journey, as it were, and had some wonderful times there. But Trump spoke. We were able to attend. He was late showing up and stuff. But he actually, it was anyway, it's a fun story because we're sitting there with the cast of Chosen and a lot of other story, in the audience waiting on Trump. So because he's late, everybody's kind of gets to know one another, starts chatting and talking. And why are you here? Well, let me tell you, so we told our story. So when President Trump mentioned it from the stage about what happened in Mount Juliet and the peaceful pro-lifers and stuff, everybody, like for 12 rows around us, all kind of turned and looked at us. So, but he'd made the promise, to pardon us then. And of course, we had hoped that he would. And I was actually in D.C. I had to go. I was recently off house arrest, but still had to get permission from the parole officer to travel, and got permission and was on a Law and Life Summit with Thomas More, who was, our attorneys throughout this ordeal that have been just fabulous and an amazing group of folks, working at Thomas More Society. I was on the panel with them, and we were talking about the case and some of the other actions they have going on. And we got, a text that Trump was signing the pardon live on TV, as we were talking. So we got to announce it real time to the audience, and it was a lot of fun. It was expected but not expected, hoped for but not really, expected. I didn't want to put too much in it, but I was really praying more for our friends that were in prison, and it impacted them obviously much more than those of us on house arrest or parole or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so we were very grateful and celebratory. It was the march took on a whole different flavor from there on forward, of course.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was also really reassuring too. I know a lot of different pro-lifers were concerned about Trump's pro-life stance or lack thereof before the election. And I think that a lot of his executive orders in the first week were really reassuring to people who did believe that he would do things for the pro-life cause. So I'm glad that there was something so obvious that he could do to help pro-lifers.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a narrative. There's a lot he's done, and that was important. And there's a few other executive orders signed, including the limitation of the FACE Act. If it doesn't get completely repealed, it at least has been restrained under his presidency. But I think too there are some. I would encourage, as grateful as I am for what he's done, I would also just offer the encouragement that a baby is a human at conception. Human life equals human rights. And there's not any age, any week limits that we can come to that will consistently apply to the unborn that the Church of Jesus Christ can actually sign off on. There has to be full recognition of the rights of humanity from the moment of conception, I think. And so I would encourage him in that. And I feel like, we're all men. We're all walking the path God has for us and learning and growing as we go. And so I would encourage everyone to pray for our president. Obviously, he's done a lot of wonderful things. I've joked recently several times, it's been so long of bad guys doing bad things that we just get used to the evil and exist with it. And good guys doing good things is really hard to cope with. I think I might need counseling. There's been so much good the first couple of weeks. I didn't need counseling for the bad things, but the good things are going to be hard to deal with. So we're excited to see what God does in this term and how this impacts our nation, hopefully for decades to come.
One of my coworkers was just joking about that this morning of he's like, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Right. Things are going well. And obviously here at HLI, we see the impact of USAID money going to pro-abortion groups. And so the fact that that's now cut, it's how that's going to affect our missionaries. And it's This is exciting, but what's the catch?
Yep. Absolutely. No, it's hard to get it. You get into the details. There's just so many things going on. It's really hard to keep up with. So it's an exciting time when there's so much good happening, you can't document it. Usually you look for a full week to post something online that's good that you can comment on. And now there's, 5 or 10 things a day that you can't keep up with. So that's a good change of pace.
Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned repealing the FACE Act. Could you just give our audience a little look? I believe you're involved in trying to help repeal it. So what does that look like? What does that mean for pro-lifers? What would it mean for churches and pregnancy centers too, if it affects those?
Sure. Well, that's the big discussion, and there's a lot of middle ground Republicans and maybe middle ground Christians, if we want to call them that, that are like, well, shouldn't we just enforce it equally? And the reality is, and I testified before a subcommittee in December on this. I'll be Heritage Foundation will be hosting a panel coming up May 6th. They posted it on the website recently, and so we'll be speaking about that. Mike Lee and Chip Roy both have corresponding bills in the Senate and the House to repeal the FACE Act. So there's a lot of traction on this, and I think it's an important thing. It was a unjust law from the beginning. It had one purpose in mind only, and that was to stifle the church from acting like unborn babies were human. And that was ultimately the point. It was to shift the narrative away from the violence done in the womb to a false narrative of violence done outside of the womb. And of the one or two, a handful of cases where there has been violence, it is not done by pro-lifers, right? And that was the narrative they tried to use to sell it to the American people and to the Congress. So, and then on top of that, Colleen, we have numbers, and we can see how it's been used for 3 decades now, and specifically over the last 2 years. And while there is, all the pro-lifers have been processed and charged and assaulted with FACE, there's been very few, I think single digits, of the hundreds of attacks on pro-life resource centers and on churches that have been even investigated, let alone charged and put under the scrutiny that the pro-lifers went under. So it is and one other point I would make, Colleen, and I said this in testimony. Look, if Roe has been turned back to the states and abortion has been pushed back to the states, then so should the punishment. There doesn't need to be a federal law guaranteeing some unequal punishment for people on one side of the discussion and not on the other. And so there is nothing that the FACE Act covers that is not already covered in state and local laws. And in fact, one of the big pushes that happened early on was, there was abortionist Dr. Gunn in Florida was killed back in the 90s. And they were trying to say this was one of the motivations, so you can't have this. Well, that had nothing to do with 99.99% of the people that are against abortion. That had to do with a rare fringe person that took it upon himself to kill a doctor. That person was then charged under Florida laws for homicide and murder, and he was sentenced, and he was given the death penalty and ultimately executed for his actions that day. FACE Act doesn't provide death penalty. It doesn't provide penalties for murder. It provides 6 months to a year. So it's completely false narrative. It's completely false bill. And I would, one other aspect of this I think the culture needs to understand is, what does that do to the public discourse? A lot of times our public discourse is based on the number of people we see in the streets on an issue, whether it's drilling for oil or Gaza or whatever it may be. We take a snapshot, through the lens of the media, rightly or wrongly, and say, well, look, there's 12 people there. Well, who are those fringe 12 people? We don't give it much credibility. But if you have a group that is literally bringing tens of thousands of people to the streets, then that is a cultural narrative worth discussing. And what do those people think? Is it something I'm missing? Is it something I should understand? And so when you have the federal government come in and weigh in through law, which ultimately ended in lawfare, and put their fingers on the scale of that public discussion by making something a felony with the intent to keep people off the street, and then they're subverting that narrative and trying to weight that narrative one way or the other. And that's what the FACE Act did for the last 30 years. And it has shifted the narrative unfairly and unjustly, against the unborn children that need our support and need our protection.
Yeah, for sure. Did you ever expect, I know that you were on Tucker Carlson and you've been on podcasts, and did you ever expect that kind of publicity to come out of this when you first got arrested? And what has that experience been like?
No, again, another chapter in the story that I didn't write. Just an amazing time. It was all the more enjoyable knowing that I had nothing to do with it. That it's just something God orchestrated. So that really freed me up, and it's just an approach in it like, God, what do you want me to share? You're giving me this platform. You want me to speak. You're giving me an audience that I would have had as a little local pro-life minister and doing sidewalk counseling and stuff. But he gave me the platform, and it's just opened up media doors left and right across the nation, internationally even, and just it's just really phenomenal. So I stand in awe every day, and every interview I do, I'm just mindful of that, and just so thankful that I get to tell his story and give him glory for what he's doing. And so it's been fun. It's been an experience I couldn't have orchestrated myself, and so that makes it all the more exciting.
Yeah, it's so nice when you can hand things over to God, and it's also kind of stressful at the same time.
Yeah.
I've always
Yep.
felt like this podcast is just his podcast. I'm like, okay, I need guests, and he sends me the guests that I need at the right time.
Sure, you bet. Yeah. And he's faithful to do it. And that's the lesson we learn. The more we put ourselves at risk, the more we learn of his faithfulness. And in every aspect of our life. So
Yeah. Well, do you have any last thoughts, Paul, today to share with our audience before we wrap up?
no, I think, Colleen, my heart in this is just to encourage the church. It's like God gives us the core virtues, and the enemy meant this for intimidation and fear, and just beating the church back into the corner. And don't you come out and speak truth and try to confront our false narratives. And I'd encourage the church just to be bold, be gracious, be kind and loving, but speak the truth, and don't bow to the narratives. We see so much of the narrative being obliterated in the last several weeks, with whether it's sodomy, DEI, and all the false narratives that are out there. God speaks to these things, and you can't really separate truth from politics, right? You can't separate God from politics. And since Christ said he is truth, it's important for us as his representatives on earth, as his image bearers, to go and be that truth, and not just in word and confession, but in our actions. And so if there's an abortion clinic near you, go out and minister to folks, speak to them, recognize the humanity of the unborn and treat them as in peril as they are. And if not, if you're in a state like Tennessee where, it's illegal now for us, we go out and we sing on the public square once a week, and we do hymns. We pray publicly. We just try to engage the culture and just be the hands and feet out loud, and trust God to continue to work in our national character, which is something that I think we see across the board in our judicial branch and the FBI and all these things. If we didn't have people that were compromised in their character and their integrity, then you wouldn't see black booted thug raids, and you wouldn't see injustice in the courts, and you wouldn't see juries not understanding their duties as citizens to hold the courts accountable and to question, narratives and stuff. So that would be the one thing I hope that God is doing through all of this, is just really encouraging his people that it's okay to be courageous, to stand up and to trust him, and just see what he does with you. It'll be an exciting ride.
Yeah. Amen. That's beautiful. Well, thank you for this conversation today, Paul. I have absolutely enjoyed. I'm so inspired by your just acceptance of God's will and just being willing to just take that and share it with the world. And it's definitely inspiring me. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Colleen. It's great to meet you, and wish you all the best.
Thank you. And to all of our audience, please subscribe. Let us know what you think about this episode in the comments, and let us know any other topics you have for future episodes that you'd like to hear about, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.